Good evening, everyone. My name is Sophie Pavel. I'm an author and science communicator from Exeter, and I'm delighted to see such a great turnout for tonight's talk. We've had over 100 people register, which is fantastic. Now, this talk is part of an exciting series for the Big Devon Meadows Count, which is a joint project between Moor Meadows and the Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. Now, if you're managing a wildflower meadow, no matter the size, we really encourage you to take part by surveying the wildflowers in your meadow this summer. You can have the help of the Moor Meadows resources. And for more information on this, we really recommend that you visit the Moor Meadows website if you haven't already, which is just moormeadows.org.uk, and there'll be a link in the chat box. Now, tonight's talk is really exciting. It's all about county wildlife sites from our project partner, the Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. Now, ecologist Jack Rivers will be explaining the vital role these sites play in saving biodiversity. And after the talk, we'll have an interactive Q&A session. So please do, while Jack's speaking, think of some questions to ask him and drop your questions into the chat box as we go. And we'll make sure that we get through as many as we can towards the end of the session. And we're also going to be joined by Ian Edgerton from the Devon Biodiversity Records Centre, who will be with us after Jack's talk for the Q&A, and that will be shortly before 8:30. Now, without further ado, here's Jack Rivers. Enjoy the evening, and thank you all for being here.
Hello, everyone. Really good to have you all here tonight. So I think my screen should hopefully share soon. There we go. So little intro to myself. So I'm a project officer at Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. So I get involved in all sorts of botanical surveys and fieldwork, but I also get involved with a lot of our community science work. So some of you might not be familiar with Devon Biodiversity Records Centre, so I thought I'd give you a brief overview of who we are and what we do. So we're one of many local environmental record centres throughout the UK. We're hosted by Devon Wildlife Trust, but we operate as a not-for-profit. And we're originally set up basically to be a central repository for wildlife data in Devon. Currently, we hold over 10 million validated records, and that's continually growing each month. And linked to this talk, we also lead the County Wildlife Site Programme in Devon, which is a big undertaking, as you'll find out throughout this talk. But ultimately, our mission is just to make high quality biodiversity data accessible, but also to use that data to help make informed decision making in the environmental sector in the world, the county, but also the world, I guess, as well. So without further ado, the thing you've all been waiting for, what is a county wildlife site? So essentially they're areas of priority habitat, which is there's a big list of priority habitats. So things like important grassland sites, woodlands, heathlands, there's a big range, and we'll go into detail on that later. But they could also be a site that supports important species. So they're first designated in the early 1990s, and the original idea was that they would complement statutory protected sites such as SSSIs, so sites of special scientific interests, and SACs, which are special areas of conservation. So they are a non-statutory designation, and I'll go into the details around that. But essentially, they don't have legal protection like those statutory sites. And they're often privately owned, which means that unseen by many people, but they're almost like hidden gems within the landscape. And yeah, the designation of county wildlife site can help to provide some protection, but there is also quite a few complications in actually designating these sites and identifying them. So they're known by various names across the UK. So another good example is local wildlife site. There are lots which I won't go through today, but just be aware there might be other sites in your counties if you're from outside of Devon that call them something different. So I'll also mention now something called an unconfirmed wildlife site, as it will come up later. But these are essentially wildlife sites that we think might be of county wildlife site quality, and they're mapped within our own holdings. But I'll go into a bit more detail about those later on. So, statutory versus non-statutory designations, I know, very exciting. So statutory sites are legally designated sites, and they're designated to protect important habitats and species throughout the landscape. And they're really meant to be the very best of nature sites within the country. And they really do support incredibly diverse habitats and species. So they are designated under UK law, and they're often included in international agreements. So they offer really strong legal protection against damaging activities, and that means that anyone that might damage a site could be prosecuted, but it also means that there are certain management requirements. So there's a few key types of statutory sites that you may already be aware of, but I'll just go over a couple of them. So SSSI I mentioned before, they're really best examples of UK wildlife and geology, so really important for science. There's SACs, so special areas of conservation. So they protect internationally important habitats, such as peatland sites and species. And that was originally linked to things like EU law, but it's now part of UK law. There's special protection areas, which safeguards rare and migratory bird species, Ramsar sites, which are international wetland sites, national nature reserves, which are just other really high quality habitats, which are managed for conservation and research, LNLRs, which are local nature reserves, and they're protected by local authorities for both wildlife and public benefit. And then MPAs, or marine protected areas, which is somewhat self-explanatory, so to protect those marine ecosystems. So that's your overall kind of summary of statutory sites. So next up is non-statutory sites, and the key thing is it includes county wildlife sites, but it also includes things like ancient woodland inventory sites. So DBRC actually conducted a review of the ancient woodland inventory a few years back, and they're essentially areas of woodland that we can evidence to have persisted since the 1600s. County geological sites, so sites of geological importance. I don't know too much about geology, but very important as well. And then special verges as well. So as a non-statutory designation, county wildlife site status and designation does not provide any of those legal protections that statutory sites have. However, the thing you do get with them is that they are taken into account during the planning process, and therefore in a situation where there is a proposed development that is considered to impact upon a county wildlife site, then additional compensation or consideration is required in the design process of that development. And although it does not have any kind of legal protections, they really do contribute to our understanding of habitats and wildlife throughout Devon and the connections they have throughout the wider countryside. The other key thing with them is that there are no management conditions for landowners who look after the site. So you can manage the site however you want if you have a county wildlife site. And there's no additional kind of conditions for you. So I've hopefully introduced you to the basics of county wildlife sites and designations, but importantly, what do they look like? So here we've got a fantastic wet woodland site. So this is a county wildlife site we surveyed a few years ago. One of my absolute favourite habitats. They can often feel almost prehistoric in their nature, super damp, lots of invertebrates buzzing around. As you can see from the picture, loads of mosses, just awesome sites. Then how about a traditional orchard? So once again, really valuable for wildlife and actually really important sites in Devon. In the southwest, we have a lot of fantastic orchards. Now here, this is quite a varied site. So this is quite a steep valley, I believe, up in North Devon somewhere. And it's got woodland, it's got some quite nice bracken assemblages, which support a really nice vernal flora or similar to a woodland flora beneath them. And there's also other kind of grassland areas within this site. Now, you might not think this, but also man-made features can be really important. For example, this one here supports seals in the UK. So not something you'd necessarily think is an important habitat, but actually really important feature. So I've already mentioned that DBRC manages and runs the County Wildlife Site Network. So we run that framework within Devon, but we do that with support from Devon Wildlife Trust and Devon County Council. And we do that through, they do that through funding, but also sharing of sites and information. So the framework itself is locally funded and it doesn't receive any central government support. So it has an ability, because of that, to be far more agile than those statutory designations. And it means they play a significant part in ensuring sites of high biodiversity value outside of those statutory sites, such as SSSIs, are recognised and protected. So we carry out the majority of surveys, but our partners and community groups that we work with also help and contribute to that. And then at the moment, we tend to designate between 20 to 30 new county wildlife sites each year. But we also do de-designate a handful of sites, but that number is a lot lower. So currently there are around 2,200 county wildlife sites and over 4,000 unconfirmed wildlife sites, which are those sites that we mentioned earlier. So these might be sites that we've noticed adjacent to existing county wildlife sites whilst we've done a survey. We might have identified them through aerial imagery, or they may have just been recommended to us. So they're derived through a majority of channels, really. So one issue we do face is, although we kind of have this large number of existing sites, we are meant to monitor them every 10 years. And since the 90s, there's been lots of land ownership changes. So it means that not all of those county wildlife site owners are known. And some of them haven't been designated for quite a while. And therefore, each year, DBRC and partners try to contact as many as possible with help from our partners. So I thought I'd give you a quick overview of the kind of general processes we go through. So first of all, at the start of the year, we try to identify sites that includes county wildlife sites that already exist, but also unconfirmed wildlife sites. And we try to identify those for surveying that year. And although we try and get that done at the beginning of the year, we will continually kind of plan throughout the year if other sites come up. So one of the most important things is gaining written landowner permission to access a site. So we've pretty much just finished that process now, but over the winter we'll write to lots of landowners to try and get permission to access their land. The only alternative scenario is if it is public access land. So following permission, we will go and conduct a botanical survey. So typically that would be a DBRC surveyor. So there's 3 of us in the field team that go out. And the idea is that a botanical survey provides really good evidence of the quality of a habitat. And it's, we often only get one chance to visit a site. So it's a survey that we can do relatively quickly, usually in one day. And then we'll use that to try and designate a site. So because you can also designate sites based off of the presence of priority species, that usually would require multiple surveys. So things like reptiles, you need to evidence breeding a lot of the time. So putting out reptile mats, regularly visiting them isn't something we have capacity for. So that may be that a local wildlife group may flag that up, or somebody with a license that has kind of put us in contact with the landowner, or something like a breeding bird survey as well, where you have to do multiple visits. So following all those surveys, we'll produce reports on those sites, and those sites are put forward to a panel of experts who will then, help us decide which sites to designate or not. Now, I'll kind of go into detail more so on some of these processes in a second. But yeah, these sites are all designated based off of detailed guidelines, and those guidelines are available on the website, which you can actually see on the bottom of this PowerPoint slide. But that will give you a really in-depth view of how sites are designated. But I will kind of go over some of the basics today. So how do we actually go about identifying those sites? So although there is already a really large network of county wildlife sites, as I mentioned, those changes in ownership often make it really difficult to know who owns a site, and that can make it really difficult to uphold that 10-year monitoring. And in some cases, we simply can't get access to those sites. So it might be that previous owners may be able to help us make contact with the new ones, or we also work with a number of community groups who have really good connections to landowners, and they might be able to talk to them about county wildlife sites and put them in contact with ourselves. And then our partners like DWT might flag up sites that they go and visit, or talk to landowners that they work with. So although we have those great connections, at times those landowners need to be identified from maps and general address searches, and that can be quite time consuming. And sometimes it's just a matter of making a best guess as to who might own a site. So with unconfirmed wildlife sites, it's slightly different, as we might not hold any pre-existing data at all. So with those county wildlife sites, they've been designated over a number of years, and we kind of have a trail of crumbs to follow, but often with unconfirmed wildlife sites, we don't have that. So it might be that we've seen them along public access routes, so walks along public footpaths. As I said, they might be in close proximity to other county wildlife sites, and they're often really natural feature designations. And then aerial imagery is really useful at kind of getting a big overview of the landscape. And then once again, community groups might help us in that process. So one thing that we're really trying to hope to promote is public awareness about county wildlife sites, as we hope that that can help support access by introducing people to what county wildlife sites are and raising their profile. And yeah, so once those sites are identified, we will write to the landowner, and we have to really receive written permission to be able to designate those sites. And yeah, we will try and get around as many sites as we can a year, but survey scheduling is really limited by funding. And as I mentioned before, there's 3 of us in the field team that cover the entirety of Devon. So that's a lot of habitat surveys. So the survey itself, it will predominantly focus on assessing the type and habitat and its condition on site. And we do that by conducting something called a walkover survey. So in the field team, we are highly skilled botanists. My colleagues are definitely better than myself, but I'm getting there. I'm getting quite good now. And we'll try to gather as much information as possible from one site visit, because often we only get one chance to visit these sites, and more might be getting in the landowner's way or other things like that. So for the survey process, we try to do a pre-survey. So gather as much data that we have on the site before going out there. That might be looking at species lists that were made before or previous reports. We'll tend to produce a map that we can then go and annotate in the field. And then once we're in the field, we'll walk around the site covering as much of the area as possible. And we'll list the botanical species present and their abundance. And we'll also map the boundaries of habitats in field. And then we'll assess the condition of the habitat as well, as that can tell us whether it's a site that's in decline, if it's recovering, or if it's stable. So this survey is free of charge to landowners, and it's funded by our project partners through something called the Biodiversity Monitoring Framework. And following that survey, it includes a follow-up report, which is also sent out to the landowners free of charge. And I'll go through the report in a second, but it includes things like a species list and habitat maps. So in some cases, partner organisations might conduct a survey for us, and they will then feed back that information for us to incorporate it into our understanding of the county wildlife site network. And actually, over the past few years, we've been working with some really quite skilled now community groups. I will give a shout out to Action for Climate in Teambridge, who I was actually running a refresher grassland course with them today, but they've contributed a number of site surveys over the past few years, which have led to designations. And by doing that, we really hope to kind of upskill botanical knowledge throughout Devon and communities, but it also really helps us expand our survey capacity. Now, we kind of did mention the Big Devon Meadow Count earlier, but it ties into this really nicely because we're continually trying to kind of evolve the ways in which we can collect data and further develop our understanding of habitats in Devon. So essentially, through the Big Devon Meadows Count, we are asking that, or we're not asking, but we're giving landowners the opportunity to survey their own sites, either individually, or they might be able to get some support, or they might know a surveyor that wants to get involved. And we've devised a sort of grassland survey methodology, which they can use, and then that data feeds back to us. And the idea with that is that More Meadows and ourselves get a really good understanding of meadows within the More Meadows network, but also Devon as a whole. And last year, for example, from those surveys, we managed to designate 4 new county wildlife sites, and several more were flagged up for further surveys. So it can also help contribute to that county wildlife site network. So definitely have a look at the Big Devon Meadows Count. It's on the More Meadows website. And yeah, there's lots more information. So the reporting itself. So as I mentioned, an individual site report is created, and that contains all the information on the habitats and species present within the site. Also goes into detail on the site condition, and we will provide sort of basic management advice as to what we think might help to improve a site. So for example, with the woodlands, you might have really dense holly in the understory that we recommend thinning, or a site such as a grassland site might be undergrazed, for example. It's getting really tusky and grass species are starting to dominate and limiting the growth of wildflowers beneath. So we might advise more grazing. So that report can be really useful for landowners. So yeah, as I said, share with the landowner, and we incorporate that into our data holdings. So where a site does not meet the criteria, we also make a note of that. So if it doesn't meet the county wildlife site criteria, we'll still let the landowners know and provide them with a report. And once we've compiled all those reports, we'll review them at the end of the year. We will essentially make a list of sites that we want to put forward for county wildlife site designation, but we will also note any sites that we visited that may have been lost or severely degraded that might need to be de-designated. And those sites will then be put towards a panel to discuss whether they are designated or de-designated. And now there's kind of the intermediary thing. So between sort of de-designation and designation is the adjusting of boundaries. So it's really important that we have accurate mapping of habitat boundaries. And with sites where they have multiple habitats, it might be that areas of scrub have expanded over the 10 years, or maybe part of the habitat's been lost. So we can alter those boundaries to update our understanding of those habitats. So the panel meeting itself, typically the panel is held in January with representatives from those partner organisations, and it contains local wildlife experts as well. So typically we have a relevant Devon County Council representative, usually from their kind of environmental department. We have someone from Devon Wildlife Trust representing them, an appropriate local authority planning or countryside officer, local naturalists of reputation, so it might be someone from a local back group, a relevant environment agency officer, or someone from Natural England, or both, and then ourselves from Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. So the survey team, including our kind of project lead and myself and kind of the other survey officers, and also Ian tends to attend as well, who you'll see at the end of this. So at the panel, the idea is that it ensures the quality of surveys, and from that we can also update designation criteria. So during the panel, all sites are open for discussion really, and that curated list that I mentioned that we develop at the end of the year is prioritised for discussion. So they tend to be the sites that might be a bit borderline, might be a potential de-designation, but everything is on the table. So typically at the end of a panel, the panel themselves will handpick a few sites at random, essentially for quality assurance, to make sure the sites we're putting forward really are up to standard. And yeah, the panel is really, really useful for reviewing those difficult sites. And actually from those discussions, that often leads to updates to the criteria. But ultimately, DBRC confirmed the designation and yeah, use the knowledge and information from the panel to inform that. So following designation of a site, the landowners will be informed as to whether their site was designated or not. And in some cases, it might be if there was a de-designation. And we'll also tend to provide kind of leaflets and information as to what that means. So following that, the sites are all then incorporated into our data holdings, and that really reflects any changes that have been made to the overall network of county wildlife sites in Devon. So I've talked a lot now about various things to do with county wildlife sites, but how does this contribute to our understanding of habitats in Devon? So here you'll see a map, which I appreciate is, yeah, possibly a bit zoomed out to see all the detail. But essentially, the dark green blotches you see on there are county wildlife sites. And the figure that they sort of comprise is 4% of the entirety of Devon. And that equates to around 30,000 hectares. And we have sort of really detailed understanding of those habitats. And as I mentioned earlier, county wildlife sites are kind of partially brought in to fill in those gaps between sites of special scientific interest. So they tend to be really big, but often not very well connected. And as you can see, county wildlife sites almost act like stepping stones throughout the landscape. So I tried to include the most recognisable habitats in this pie chart, but this is essentially trying to give you an overview of the broad habitats. So 45% of county wildlife sites contained a mixture of habitats. So they might be sites that have calm grassland, woodland habitats, grasslands, all mixed together. So they tend to be slightly larger sites. You'll probably notice that there's quite a big other category, which is 17%. And that includes broader designations. So, for example, entire estuaries have been designated as county wildlife sites, and often the associated habitats with those estuaries. So that's why they make quite a big chunk of the area. Oh yeah, I should say that this is representative of the total area, so kind of over 30,000 hectares. So this is what the percentages represent. And then followed by that is woodland habitats. So 15% of that area of county wildlife's sites are woodland habitats, followed by grasslands, and then calm grasslands, which is a real speciality in Devon, particularly North Devon. So how about the condition of those sites? So as I mentioned, there's been a whole load of sites designated since the 90s, and actually over 50% of them, we don't know what the condition of them are. And that might just be because there wasn't that initial baselining done. But actually 26% of them are considered to be in decline, or they kind of might just be starting that recovery process. 16% of them are considered to be stable, and then 6% of them are considered to be quite severely degraded. So the largest county wildlife site we have is well over 700 hectares. The average site is around 13 hectares. And then the smallest sites can encompass less than 1 hectare. And they're often sites that are designated based off of the presence of priority species. So that's the general overview of the County Wildlife Site Network. So how about the year that's just gone? So last year we contacted 146 landowners. Of those, 55 responded, and that's kind of around a third is what we see each year. And of those 55, 8 of them refused access. So we gained permission for a number of sites, but in total, we accessed and surveyed 112 sites, with 61 of those being already existing county wildlife sites. And that does also include partners as well as the BRC. So during the survey season, we designated 33 new county wildlife sites. We ended up making boundary changes to 11, and we de-designated 2 sites. Now, of those 55 sites that we did have condition data for, 25% were found to be kind of in decline. 71% were found to be sort of stable, and only 4% were found to be improving or kind of recovering. So you might be wondering, there's all this data that I've been discussing, but is it accessible or not? So you can see a sort of limited resolution view of county wildlife sites on the Devon Environment Viewer. However, the resolution of that data is limited for multiple reasons. So, as I mentioned, some of those sites support rare species and also habitats, and it's important that their locations are not publicised in order to provide some additional protection from disturbance. Also, by limiting that resolution that's publicly available, it prevents individuals assuming any rights of public access, which might cause disturbance to the landowner or tenant farmers, but also the wildlife there. So the data itself is provided in our products and services, and that's provided to those that need the information for professional purposes, such as commercial ecologists that might use the data for environmental impact assessments. And then in addition to kind of all of that, it's worth noting that we don't receive any central funding through the government, and therefore we recoup our running costs for kind of maintaining our data holdings by charging for access for a range of the data. And that means we can continually update it, maintain our data holdings and improve those data holdings. So as I mentioned, we're continually adding more records and more data on county wildlife sites. So we do that by making charges to local authorities, ecological consultants, and other environmental projects that need access to the data as part of their work. So I'll go into detail now a bit more around the designation criteria for county wildlife sites, just to kind of give you a snapshot. I mean, the actual designation kind of guidelines is quite a big document, but it is really interesting. Definitely give it a read, bedtime reading. So designation criteria. So, what's happened there? Right. So, you don't need to worry about the kind of various designations and acts, but essentially under the NERC Act of 2006, it listed the section 41 of that lists 56 habitats and 943 species, which are of principal importance for biodiversity in England. So these are habitats that fall under something called the UK Biodiversity Action Plan, which was originally launched in 1994, and has been continually updated since. So in Devon, we do also have some nuances. So there's something called, essentially Devon's own kind of biodiversity action plan defines key biodiversity features of county-wide conservation priorities. So particular habitats such as those on Dartmoor are kind of considered slightly differently. And while kind of biodiversity action plans do guide kind of general conservation actions, they don't determine site selection in themselves. So there's something called the Ratcliffe criteria, which I'll discuss in a second, which kind of uses those biodiversity action plan habitats and information to support designations. So other key things, so within Devon itself, we have 1,600 priority species, which are typically rare species, so they might be threatened, particularly in Devon, and also 96 species which are considered to be special in Devon. So possibly the cutest one there is the dormouse. That covers a whole array of things, from plants to invertebrates to mammals. There's a whole load of them. So I mentioned the Ratcliffe criteria, and essentially it's a standard method for assessing conservation value. So the key things that we look at are size. So essentially, the bigger the habitat, the better in most cases. There's naturalness. So although that is somewhat subjective, it tends to be based off of other kind of existing habitat of good quality that we know about, and any historic data we do have that we can use to gauge kind of what truly natural sites would be like. Although arguably in the UK, there's not many sites which are completely natural. So representativeness, essentially, is it a good example of that habitat? Rarity, self-explanatory. How frequently does it occur within the county? Diversity, so is there variety in habitats and species, but also structure. Structure is incredibly important for species. Ecological position, so how does that habitat function in a landscape? So does it provide more opportunities for species for breeding, for example? We'll look at the recorded history of a site. So did it have important historical context, and has it changed over time? Fragility, how susceptible that habitat is to change. Potential value of the site, so sites that have the potential to be improved and be restored to a more natural state. And intrinsic appeal, so nature is intrinsically important and it's appealing to ourselves as humans. So is it kind of a good natural nature site? So yeah, this criteria essentially underpins all county wildlife site selection. But there are kind of finer details of the guidelines linked to specific habitats. So as it's not an exact science, we often rely on kind of expert judgment and also local knowledge of habitats. And that's really important in borderline cases where we've had it in the past that there aren't many opportunities for kind of invertebrates in certain areas. So although a site might not be as diverse as we'd expect, if it provides good foraging opportunities for invertebrates, that might add a bit more weighting to it. But yeah, the overall kind of county wildlife site manual and guidance is to offer kind of that detailed guidance we need, but it also acknowledges that there is a need for professional interpretation as well. So, interestingly, I thought I'd include this. There are designation opportunities for artificial habitat. So you'll see on the screen a golf course, which you might think, hang on, they're not usually brilliant for wildlife, but actually in Devon, we have some fantastic golf courses for wildlife. I don't play golf myself. I'm not particularly interested in it, but I have spent quite a bit of time crawling around Dawlish Warren Golf Course, counting something called the Warren crocus, which is a beautiful wildflower, but particularly rare. Yeah, artificial habitats. So these might be man-made or heavily modified. So man-made, like parts of the harbour that I showed earlier on, right at the beginning, that support seals. So examples include things like arable land that might have been set aside, or improved grassland that might support important species like soil bunting. Other things like wildlife corridors, so hedgerows, green lanes, dry stone walls, road verges, parts of railway verges or disused railway lines, and then other modified areas such as golf courses, which might just happen to support some calcareous grassland, which we don't actually have much of in Devon. And even kind of, urban built environments can provide a lot of value for wildlife. So, seeing as this is a talk for more meadows, I thought I should include some detail on grassland criteria. So, the main thing to look for is a grassland site that is, well, it's not the main thing in other things, but one of the thresholds is that a site is greater than 0.5 hectares. So if there is already a recorded MVC community, which is outlined in the County Wildlife Site guidelines, then it could be designated. I should say MVC, ecologists are terrible at making abbreviations, but that stands for National Vegetation Classification. And essentially, I believe it was in the 90s onwards, a bunch of botanists went out, recorded lots of plants and decided to label them with communities and numbers. So you could essentially map habitats, something that, casual nature enthusiasts not expected to know, but we often use it for really detailed habitat assessments. But typically that requires lots of quadrats, lots of detailed surveying, and we don't always have that opportunity for county wildlife site designations. So therefore, we look at other grasslands that might contain it. So broad categories of acidic grassland, mesotrophic grasslands, so neutral soils, and calcareous grasslands. So those which are more base rich tend to be on things like limestone deposits, and they tend to support a much higher number of species. So we look at a high diversity of species, and that is typically based around 1 meter square quadrats. So we look at essentially the number of different grasses, sedges, and herbs over a 1 meter squared area, and then done multiple times over a habitat. So for acidic grasslands, we're looking for 10 species or more to potentially qualify as a county wildlife site. For neutral grasslands, we're looking at 15 species or more. And then for calcareous grasslands, we're looking at 20 species or more. So the other thing is, if we go and look at that assemblage and we can look at it and go, yeah, this clearly matches an existing MVC classification, then, and it meets that greater than 0.5 hectares, then that would also be a way to designate a site. And then also we look at the presence and wide distribution of indicator species. So indicator species are essentially plants which are indicative of good quality habitat, but also good condition of habitat. So we do have a list of indicator species. So for a neutral grassland or calcareous grassland, you might come across things like orchids, yellow rattle, everyone seems to know now because of its kind of really good function in grassland ecosystems, things like knapweed. So really lovely natural kind of wildflowers. So typically at least 5 of the indicator species listed in the guidelines should be present on a site and should occur widely throughout. So that will help with designation. And although I mentioned that most sites need to be kind of 0.5 hectares or greater, there are some nuances. So for example, churchyards can be fantastic for wildlife, and they often can support really rich grassland communities. So they can be as small as 0.25 hectares and still be designated. And particularly, they might be in an urban environment as well, where it's some of the only grassland around. And also, sites would not normally be chosen for kind of species richness alone. So if you're not seeing those indicator species associated with particular habitats, then it, might not meet the criteria. So now I thought I would kind of discuss really the importance of county wildlife sites. Essentially how they function connectivity-wise, but also everything else they contribute. So county wildlife site flags up really important wildlife sites, and as they're often in private ownership, they're often overlooked. So by becoming a county wildlife site, becoming part of the monitoring, we can really kind of understand the trends throughout Devon of species distribution, habitat condition, and also connectivity. So yeah, what I just mentioned there, it really does facilitate that monitoring. And it's kind of even easier if we can kind of maintain an understanding of who owns the land. And really, ultimately, by knowing what's on a site, we can try our best to conserve and support biodiversity. So now I thought it would be quite interesting to look at connectivity within the landscape. So I am a botanist, but I have to admit I truly love landscape ecology in the broader sense. It was kind of my background at university. So a bit of mapping and habitats from a broad scale, absolutely love it. So what we're looking at here is sites of special scientific interest. So this map is a little bit older, but it works for the purposes of this demonstration. So actually along this southern edge, it's relatively well connected, and these sites are quite big. So I mentioned before, kind of bigger is often better for habitats. But as you move inland, there isn't much connectivity. And when you look at these sites, there's not a lot of connectivity between them. But surely there's more habitat there. So actually, if we bring in the county wildlife site layer, we can see that there's actually a lot more habitat sites that are brilliant for wildlife, but importantly, they act as those key connecting features throughout the landscape, connecting up those sites of special scientific interest, but also other county wildlife sites. Now, that's brilliant. That's kind of our current understanding, but we think there's probably more. So this is where unconfirmed wildlife sites come back in. So these are those sites that we might have peeked over a fence and seen, or they might have been identified through aerial imagery, but we've not yet managed to survey them or make contact with landowners. So although we might have very limited understanding of the habitats there, there's really potential to further our understanding of those habitats. Now, the other thing I should say as well is our kind of unconfirmed wildlife site layer is not exhaustive. So we use this kind of as best as we can to try and find new sites. But because they are unconfirmed sites, it's not really something that we kind of share with partners as evidence of what a habitat is. They're really sites that we need to learn more about. But actually, there's likely many more sites throughout that landscape that would be of county wildlife site quality. And actually, once again, that's partially where the Big Devon Meadows count comes in, because even if they're smaller meadows, they'll make such a difference in that connectivity and understanding. So I've gone through designations, I've gone through their kind of wider benefits, but what is the kind of benefits of designation? So yeah, absolutely, it provides some additional protections to the site by flagging it up in the planning process, but it also raises the awareness of the importance of biodiversity with landowners or people that might kind of access the site. So by having a county wildlife site survey and getting that designation, it can help signpost and evidence, provide evidence to support application for wildlife and habitat management subsidies. So I was actually chatting to someone that works within a community group today, or doesn't work, but volunteers within a community group, and as one of our surveyors, they were talking to me about how their CWS designation was used alongside their higher tier stewardship application, and they were successful in that process. And I know I'm not an expert in subsidies by any means, it's not my background, but I know that's an ever-changing field at the moment. Also, what it does do is it absolutely acts as a gold standard for wildlife management. So often landowners that are managing county wildlife sites or unconfirmed wildlife sites, for example, their efforts aren't necessarily recognised, and by gaining county wildlife site status, it's almost like winning a gold medal. You know, that is a fantastic wildlife site and you're putting in amazing effort. But also it offers that deeper understanding of sites to a landowner. You know, with the report, we provide detailed species list, detailed habitat maps, really important information. And then that can help with prioritization, for example, with advisors that work for Devon Wildlife Trust and other partners when they work with landowners. So what is the future of county wildlife sites? Well, we will absolutely continue to identify sites, carry on doing surveys, and just do what we can to raise the awareness of county wildlife sites. So in theory, that network of county wildlife sites should continue to expand, and that really helps us to paint a more detailed picture of the status of wildlife and habitats within Devon. It will help we'll look to further develop ways of identifying and surveying potential sites, so through the Big Devon Meadows count and similar partnerships. And ultimately, we hope to continually raise the profile of county wildlife sites throughout the county. So that pretty much brings me to the end of my talk. So hopefully that's given you a snapshot into what county wildlife sites are. They truly are fantastic habitats. I mean, I feel really privileged to have had the opportunity to see some amazing ancient kind of bits of woodland, bits of common grassland. Really, there's, a lot of variety in county wildlife sites. There is more information available on our website, which you can read up on about the biodiversity monitoring framework, and also the guidelines are on there for the selection of county wildlife sites. And that should just about bring us in time for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jack. That was fascinating, and just seeing that map of 30,000 hectares of Devon just reminds me how large it is as a county. It's so varied, and so this is really exciting to learn about. And I particularly love the image of you crawling around Dawlish Warren looking for rare crocuses. That was very enjoyable. So we'll head straight into the Q&A. We've got some lovely questions here. And I think this first one from Cindy actually would be a lovely one to start with, because it might be a good recap. So Cindy asks, just where are the Devon County wildlife sites listed?
Yeah,
so on that one, Jack?
You go for it, Ian.
We've got Ian with us now, which is
sorry. Hi everyone. I just so I'm Ian Edgerton. I manage the Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. I've done for about 14 years now. Blimey, so therefore I've had a strong connection to this framework for during that period of time. And by the way, I must just say congratulations, Jack. A, being on time, and B, you must have almost lost your voice after 50 minutes of that. Well done. So yeah, going through the questions. So in terms of where, so as Jack mentioned, DBRC administers the framework, and we keep the register of these sites. There are actually 2,281 of them as of today. We don't make that publicly accessible, as Jack said, because there are sensitivities around landowners don't particularly want their boundaries and a lot of high resolution information about their sites generally in the public domain. It can sometimes infer, people will take that as public access, and it can cause other problems. But also, we, like many other businesses like the Met Office Ordnance Survey, we have to run a sort of blended business model because it's not centrally funded by government. We do have to make charges for access to the data, typically to the professionals that need it, and we make it much more accessible to communities and safe community projects and things like neighbourhood planning. So we have lots of routes where it can flow into decision making, but it is not publicly available, and certainly not the sort of details of owners and etc. There's a couple of questions that are sort of connected to that, which is, can I get my site looked at? How do I know if I've got one? And things like that. So DBRC, if you ever have questions around any of those sort of things, you just have to give us a call, drop us an email. We can check on our system whether you have got one, whether it used to be one, whether it could be one, and then go from there. But as Jack said, we've got a limited budget, limited availability on an annual basis, so obviously can only deal with so much at any one time. Hence, try and work with partners like Moor Meadows and others as much as we possibly can. I think there were actually might have been one or two specific questions here about can I get mine looked at? And the question is very valid. Yeah, I mean, if you've got one already, that's brilliant, because even if we can't look at it this year, we could potentially book it in for next year, and give ourselves a bit of a head start for next year.
I would just add to that as well. So if it's a site, we typically revisit them every 10 years. So it might be that your site is kind of already on our list and already flagged up. And then when it kind of comes around to it, we will get in contact with you.
That's interesting, Jack, because I wonder if that feeds into the question I had, where you were talking about those individual site reports on the species and habitat condition. Would those be repeated within that decade as well, or is that a separate repetition of a visit?
Yep. So each time we visit a site, we will produce a full report. So because
I imagine it would change a lot within 10 years.
Yeah, it can do. Yeah. So yeah, some sites will get better. You'll see an increase in diversity, but actually quite a lot of the time we have seen kind of declines in species. But yeah, I think that's one of the brilliant things about the County Wildlife Site Network and the monitoring of those sites is you can look at those changes over time, and you can map those changes in habitats, and it's all really useful and really important information.
Just on the 10-year thing, actually, that was the original hope, that we would see these sites every 10 years. And when the framework was developed, but in terms of the funding that's available to do it, as time has gone on, that has constricted. So we're actually now at the moment probably operating on around 5%. We're seeing things probably every 20 years. That would be the capacity that we've currently got. So it's a framework that has been in place now for, as Jack said, since the 90s. The actual monitoring framework that we run has only been in place since 2009. So with 15 years in, and we've seen around 1,200 sites out of 2,281. So over half. But yeah, so we're running at unfortunately, half of what we would like to have, or what the program originally set out to try and do, and that is all down to capacity.
Yeah, that's really important to know. Now, this question I found intriguing. Charles Sinclair asks, you mentioned wildlife corridors. Have you any stretches of river or rivers that are designated as a county wildlife site?
I can grab that one as well, Jack. Hi, Charles. Nice to hear from you again. So this has been a subject of much discussion in Devon over probably the last decade. There are a lot of counties, as Jack said, we're one of 47 record centres around the UK. Every county has one. Most run these frameworks with partners, and our criteria tends to be based on local priorities. So we'll have priority habitats in Devon that may not be in other counties, and vice versa. So when it comes to rivers, there are places, I know certainly in some of the places in Wales, where they've just blanket said every river is a county wildlife site. That was not deemed to be something that was right for Devon originally when the criteria was set out. Our approach was to try and take something more site specific. But over the last 10 years, it's been very difficult to actually come up with a set of working criteria, principally because if you take a stretch of river, it could have hundreds of landowners in the applicable stretch that you're talking about. And how do you mandate that? How do you contact them all, get permissions, etc.? But secondly, is it could change on an annual basis. You get flow because of the flow. The sediment might, one of the qualifying features might move within the river because the river's been in spate, and an area of the sort of gravel bed might have shifted hundreds of yards. There's loads of other things like that are sort of make them fairly mobile. And one of the things about the county wildlife site criteria also is there's got to be a reason to designate it. So what's the added benefit of designating it? Is it going to make it more protected? Is it going to be more likely to be managed? And whereas you can have, let's say, like Jack mentioned, a site of common grassland that gets designated, and the landowner might think, right, I'm really proud of this and I'm going to make more of an effort to manage it well. That's not really easily transferable to a river that again is in multiple ownership and highly mobile, changing all the time. So it's something that we've wrestled with, not just us, and it's probably a good point where Jack mentioned earlier about experts coming in and help us do this work. So we've had people from the EA, West Country Rivers Trust, all involved in this discussion, and yet to come up with an answer for it here. We've had big estuaries. So the Dart estuary, that was designated as one big county wildlife site. But again, in terms of its value of designating it, when it was then sort of flagged up in planning, what did that mean? Okay, you've got this massive stretch of estuary that's been designated. What we tend to try and do now, as we have done with the salt marsh project that we did last year with the Environment Agency, is go back and look at those, what are the actual really important features of that estuary. And so we've picked out individual salt marsh sites and designated them on their own value, rather than have them sort of hidden within this amorphous title of just being a River Dart county wildlife site. So yeah, still a work in progress on that one, Charles, unfortunately. So it doesn't help your project that you've got going down in the Sid.
Oh, that's super interesting. Thank you, Ian. Now, there's a couple biodiversity-related questions that are coming from Moor Meadows. The first one, I think, is an important one to clarify. So, Jack, you mentioned the importance of structure for wildlife and biodiversity. Could you expand on that a bit, please?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I think a good example is like a grassland site. So, obviously, grasslands support invertebrates, birds, different wildflowers, and you really want variation in structure. So by that, invertebrates might use kind of areas of bare ground, reptiles might use bits of basking habitat, or kind of log piles and areas as refugia. So that can be really beneficial. Often we see in sites that might be undergrazed, you get something called the development of the thatch layer. So where grasses grow really tall and rank, they'll start matting together, and that can actually restrict light and resources for other species. So actually having some more open areas will allow other species to colonize areas. But essentially having that variation provides more niches for different species. But also that's kind of at quite a localized scale. At a landscape scale, you have species that will use the landscape differently. So a really good example of that would be like a predatory bird. So they might kind of nest kind of more internally in a woodland, so they kind of have protection for themselves. So having a core area of woodland habitat is really important. But actually when it comes to hunting, they'll need a vantage point. So by having an extended area of woodland edge that then feeds is probably the wrong word, but grades into a field, that might give them an area to perch, to view, to rest. So actually, by looking at how the landscape functions as a whole, it can provide some really important information about how different species function and use habitats. Hopefully that's a good basic summary.
Yeah, lovely in a nutshell, thank you. And I guess related to that then, if we sort of flip it on its head, if you were to lose a species that the site was designated for in the first place, so let's say a rare species, does that affect the designation at all?
Do you want me to take this one, Ian? Yeah. So it kind of depends on the site. So often if you do have a protected species, that is somewhat the result of having already quite good habitat there. So although it depends on the discussion that was had at the panel and how a site was designated, but it might be that the habitat present is still of county wildlife site quality, and in that case, it might not be de-designated. The other thing you might want to consider is, once again, it kind of comes down to connectivity in the landscape. So evidently that habitat supported that species in the past. So it might be that there is good cause to maintain it as a county wildlife site if there is potential for that kind of species to recolonize an area. However, ultimately, if it was a small site and it was completely kind of dug up, the species was lost, the site was improved, then that would lead to a de-designation. I don't know if there's anything you want to expand on that, Ian.
Only in as much as, probably to give some context, so there are SSIs that are designated for their species interest, so they're statutory set in law and have that level of protection, where that species has not been recorded there for 20 years. So again, you know, it's very sort of similar thought process, really, that if there is still wildlife value or habitat, good habitat there, then just because the citation might say that originally it was designated for this, if there's other values, you just take a pragmatic view on it, and it may well be that that species, you know, could come back. So again, depending on sort of, you know, how volatile that species or how mobile it might be. I mean, in terms of, so on the reverse of that, actually, we had to review. We've got a criteria for cell buntings now. Cell buntings, we designate sites that are within working landscapes. Within typically South Devon, there tends to be the concentration of that species, and they like sort of stubble fields and hedgerows, and you know, you wouldn't typically look at it and say, right, that's a fantastic habitat. It just tends to be where they spend part of their time. And because the RSPB had such a good positive response from their cell bunting project, and cell bunting numbers started to increase quite a lot, we had to up the number of cell buntings present for it actually, you know, it used to be like you could be a county wildlife site if there were a couple of breeding cell buntings, but then they recovered so well in that area that we had to make it 6 and then 8, and because otherwise we'd have been designating every field in the South Hams. So yeah, there's some success stories that also affect the way that we look at these things as well.
The thing I just thought that I'd add as well is just to reiterate that often we only get kind of one chance to survey that site when we go, and there might be limitations on seasonality. So certain plant species might only be observable at one time of the year. And if it so happens that the landowner can only facilitate us accessing site when we're unlikely to see that species, we might just not come across it. And also things like bee orchids, they can just disappear for quite a few years and then they'll pop up again quite happily. So yeah.
Same with wax caps.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they like to do their disappearing acts, don't they? And I think Charles's second question is actually, I think, follows on nicely. So he says, if you receive a lot of interesting sightings recorded through the DBRC at a particular location, would that trigger an inquiry from you to the landowner?
It does, in terms of species sightings, it doesn't tend to correlate. So because the county wildlife site framework is 99% around sort of the habitat, the presence of priority habitat, very few of the sites actually designated for species, and if they are, it's a particular species. So it would tend to be so if in answer to Charles's question specifically, you know, if someone gave us a record of great crested newt, then we could designate that site based on those records, because there's specific criteria for that. If we'd have had records of lots of different amphibians, it wouldn't have piqued our interest. It has to be about something specific that fits with the criteria, generally speaking, if it's species. And then the other stuff is 99% of it is just the presence of priority habitat that would pique our interest. Typically, though, the first thing would happen is it would go on the list of candidate potential sites, and it would go on a list where, you know, we're slowly working through that. So it would certainly not be one that would jump to the front of the queue unless it was something very rare indeed, and potentially something that linked to an existing project, so it was a priority for some other reason as well.
Thank you. Now, to help people sort of have a call to action, as there's so much information here that's all really interesting, how can people get involved with surveying potential sites for county wildlife designation, and is there training available for these sorts of things?
Go on, Jack.
Yeah, okay. So the main thing I'd say at the moment is the Big Devon Meadows count. So if you have a site that you can register with the Big Devon Meadows count, that will feed into our understanding and might potentially flag up county wildlife sites. If you are in Teambridge, for example, Action Climate in Teambridge, you get in contact with them. With kind of provided the training that we would do this year, but they have really knowledgeable individuals that will take people on surveys. But in terms of other involvement, Ian, you might want to expand on this, but there are kind of limitations on capacity in terms of training we can offer. Yeah, I don't know if you want to expand on that at all, Ian.
Only that it changes year by. So we take advantage of any of the opportunities we can get through funded projects to include training for volunteers and communities, and we try and leverage that into bids wherever we can. And those projects tend to ebb and flow. So, as an example, there's been quite a big citizen science element of the Saving Devon Treescapes project that we've been involved in, and that's been able to provide training, as an example, around lichens. And we can designate sites for churchyards, typically again for maybe lichen interest, things like that. So it's just trying to make those connections, and where we haven't got the current capacity, and we might have some real interest from people in. Because the Big Meadows count obviously is very much about one section of habitats, grassland sites. But if there's you might have a woodland or other type of habitat that isn't covered by that, in which case we would just try and look to try and join you up with the right project, or you may need to wait a little bit of time until we've got another project where we can cover some training and cover it through that that other funding stream.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. That sounds useful to know. So, unless anyone in the audience has any further questions, I think that sort of brings us to a natural close for this evening.
One more point, Sophie. Cindy asked for email contact details.
Oh yes, so she did.
I'm more than happy for my contact details my email to be circulated. I can't get in the chat. I would have answered, but I can't get in the chat at the moment. So by all means, do circulate my email address or pop it into the chat, whichever is easiest for you, because I'm more than happy to field questions, and anything that comes up post this, that's absolutely fine. And certainly if people think they have got a county wildlife site, then obviously we would want to talk to them. That would be great.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ian. Also, I did actually miss a question from All Meadows, which is where can people find the full list of priority species? There's a huge range, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. So Devon priority species, if that's what it's looking at, I believe on the Devon Local Nature Partnership website, that lists species in Devon. For the county wildlife site aspect of things, you can look on the DBRC website, where you have the county wildlife site designation guidelines. If you're looking at broader kind of UK priority species, can't remember where it is, but if you just Google kind of UK priority species, I believe it'll be kind of on government websites which list those. Someone might be able to give a more specific link to that.
Cool, thank you, Jack. That sounds great. Just to let you know, tonight's talk has been recorded and will be available on the More Meadows YouTube channel by next week. And if you haven't already, it's really worth checking out the channel. It's a fantastic resource for meadow makers and anyone interested in creating wild habitats or just finding out a bit more about what's going on. There's so much great information there. And you can, of course, look at over 60 other informative videos covering everything from how to identify native meadow grasses to creating your own meadow in your garden, and even managing hedgerows for wildlife to conservation grazing. So a really nice variety. And the link is in the chat box on the channel just here, or you can just type in More Meadows YouTube into your search engine. And if you, Ian's email is in the chat there. That's really helpful. Thank you. So do make use of that. And if you have a meadow in Devon or elsewhere in the southwest, no matter its scale, what size it is, please consider adding it to our Meadows map and help build the data on the More Meadows website. It's so valuable to help us build a picture across the county. The map showcases the collective effort being made by individuals to help reverse wildlife decline. And as of this week, we've now reached 3,000 acres on the map, which is amazing, a huge milestone and a massive collaborative effort. So that's definitely something to celebrate. And yeah, thank you so much to tonight's speaker, Jack Rivers, and thank you to Ian Edgerton from the Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. And thank you to you, for our audience, for joining us this evening, and to the wonderful Tracy and Donna behind the scenes. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.